This sitting is resumed. We return to order number 1. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. You have 2 hours and 25 minutes television time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning to you. Don't think I will need that 2 hours and 25 minutes television time. As I indicated to you last time I spoke in this Honourable House, it will not be my practice of detaining the House beyond the time necessary to say what I have to say. And so I shall keep that commitment to you today. But sir, moments of crisis give summons to the best resolve of those whose minds conceive not only of the problematic, but also of the possible. Those whose hands are enthusiastic to the task, those whose eyes are visionary, those whose ears clearly hear the beckoning cry and the call of the nation to their moment of duty, and whose hearts are knit in purpose with the people in the cause of moving as swiftly as is practicable beyond the weeping of the night season to the joy which comes to meet us in the morning. It is in that spirit that I take the presentation of the government side as led by the Honourable Prime Minister yesterday. My own attempts to capture the mindset and mood of herself and the government relative to the proposals and the statements put before us of yesterday. Notwithstanding that, sir, we were treated yesterday to the presentation of a set of budgetary proposals by the Honourable Prime Minister, which some may call ambitious and others reflective of a desperate economic circumstance in which the country finds itself and a government's commitment to remedy the situation. But I remind us that the Honourable Prime Minister characterized the government's response to our current economic reality as, quote, bitter medicine. I repeat, bitter medicine. I don't know that there are many who like medicine, particularly if it is bitter. An examination of the specifics of the proposals would tend to suggest that government embraces the commonly held view that the bitterer the medicine, the better for the patient, and the faster for his or her recovery. It's like the old Buckley's advertising slogan, it's awful, but it works. I think what I heard the Honourable Prime Minister to say on behalf of the government yesterday is that the medicine is bitter, it is awfully bitter, but it will work. But there is an alternative perspective outside the corridors of government, which suggests that the measures imposed yesterday represent an octopus-like approach to addressing the problems confronting the country. That is, you give with one tentacle or hand, and you take back with the other 7 tentacles. Now, Mr. Speaker, our problem has been clearly identified by many and over time. Declining foreign reserves, high debt levels, problematic fiscal deficit. Add to that, over the last couple of years, poor credit rating. While we appreciate the desire of the government to cease the dithering of the last 5 years as Nero watched Rome burn, and while we applaud government's readiness to tackle our issues frontally, government's response must be critically examined in relation to the above. The following questions, therefore, Mr. Speaker, are relevant and pertinent. 1, with foreign reserve levels at 7 weeks of import cover, the government have to move with such haste to declare a selective default. Opinion, of course, is varied on this matter, but it is a pertinent consideration with the level of foreign reserves which now obtained. Did we in fact have to move with such haste to declare a selective default? 2, as a proportion of total government debt, whether we accept the 13 billion that is published by the central bank, or whether we accept the 15 billion as proffered by the government side, and we understand how they reached to that figure, the foreign component of the total debt is only about $2.7 billion. Similarly, therefore, Mr. Speaker, the question is, did this represent a situation such that we had to seek new arrangements with our international creditors, and to do so at this stage? The concern really is relative to the potential negative impact on our reputation as a country long reputed for honoring its debts, and honoring its debts fully, and honoring its debts on time. When you default on debt, you put Barbados in ranking with places like Moldova, Ivory Coast, Nicaragua, Ukraine. Our reputation, therefore, is the issue to which we have to pay some attention, and the question will be debated for a while as to whether or not the government, by its action at this time, has brought that reputation into question, such as it has never been the case before. A fourth question is, what percentage of the interest rate payments will Barbados save by readjusting our credit arrangements? Now, you can speculate, but if you apply generously a 10% savings, you achieve, in fact, only a $76 million level of savings against a $762 million expenditure. And is that adequate to achieve the goals which we have in mind with respect to our spending and our deficit? And that's a $762 million interest expenditure, let me be clear, out of which you get 76 million if you generously apply the 10%, proportion. In the absence of investment inflows, number 5, and medium-term growth strategies, a regime of principally taxation may serve to protect your balance of payments, but it will also contract economic activity and output. Hence, this could prove to be counterproductive to the revenue-generating initiatives of the government, both those now outlined and those yet to come. Question, therefore, is what then is the net effect on your projected deficit? So we declare default. We pursue debt reprofiling. We introduce a regime of tax austerity and prepare to enter into an arrangement with the International Monetary Fund. That's where we are. Declared default. We're going to pursue debt restructuring. We've introduced a regime of tax austerity, and we're preparing to enter into an arrangement with the IMF. But there are those who argue alternatively that recourse could have been made and perhaps should have been made to a sovereign creditor, that might have been considered as one of our primary options. Now, of course, when the idea of approaching sovereign creditors is mooted, the usual suspects are named. China, we have heard in recent days. The UAE, we heard repeatedly in this Honourable House from the last administration, or one of its spokesmen, and outside of this House. But perhaps a look could have been taken at the Cayman Islands. Cayman Islands is now the third biggest holder of U.S. foreign debt, surpassed only by China and Japan. I'm advised that holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds in Cayman reached $265 billion at March 2018, which was up more than 30% from the same the period previous year. So a suggestion which some argue should have been given serious consideration, as opposed to the approaches which the government has taken and plans to take with respect to restructuring the overseas debt and entering into an arrangement with the IMF under the current circumstances. Perhaps this could have provided an alternative financing option for government. At least consideration of it is what is being advocated. The government proposes under the Barbados Economic Recovery Plan, as I understand it, to close in on the fiscal deficit this year, to achieve this more comfortably in year 2, and to run a surplus from year 3. Now, this is largely premised on a regime of taxation and user fees, and expenditure cuts in relation to statutory corporations. One critical question emerges, and that has to do with the potential for negative impact on employment in Barbados. And this without reference to any IMF employment cost prescription, which is likely to follow later. In fact, another related question is, are we truly devising a homegrown program of corrective measures, or is this in fact the reflection of our reaction to signals already being received from the International Monetary Fund? I am in no way suggesting that that is the case. I'm simply raising the query which any reasonable person would raise. Are we in fact devising a homegrown program, or is this in fact reflecting the signals which already we are receiving from the International Monetary Fund as to the strictures which are in store for the Barbados economy and the Barbadian people? You'll recall, Mr. Speaker, former Prime Minister Sir Lloyd Sandiford pertinently put the question, how did we get back here? Many of us have oft repeated that question, but I would humbly suggest that too few of us have sufficiently often considered the answer. Nor have we been adequately sobered by the obvious wisdom that flows from that reflection. I believe had we been so sobered, Mr. Speaker, we would have realized that there is economic unwisdom in the policy contradiction of dampening consumption demand while at the same time relying on the taxation revenue that comes from that consumption. There's a certain paradox, there's a certain unwisdom in such a policy of implementation or imposition of taxation to dampen demand, while at the same time relying on that taxation revenue that comes from that consumption. It really represents the convergence of the need to protect the balance of payments, while at the same time needing to increase government revenue by recourse to excessive taxation. Protecting the balance of payments is a necessary and noble goal. Excessive recourse to taxation, while it may achieve that, but if it's a regime imposed in the absence of a growth orientation sufficiently robust and viable as to positively spur revenue generation, then we have problems. The outflow from that has been an over-reliance on borrowings, both foreign and domestic, and I'm referring to the experience under the previous administration. And in recent times, excessive dependence on central bank financing. The past administration practically doomed us economically by its failure to resist the practice of exceeding its overdraft claims upon the central bank's supply. Printing of money for the meeting of current expenditure. A situation which will generate consumer spending with significant levels of foreign component input in a situation where it is not backed by the availability of earned foreign dollars or would have to be supported by costly borrowings. I remind us, therefore, Mr. Speaker, that this is how we got here. The question asked has to be answered. How did we get back here? This is how we got here. And that reminiscing should convey to us that we must of course exercise the necessary caution as we structure our regime of taxation going forward in the current situation. Now, minus the printing of money, this current government runs the risk of falling into the same trap as the previous administration by contracting the economy and underperforming in its revenue generation objectives based, in my view, on these tax proposals. In 2008, one of the first actions of the former administration was to raise over $100 million in taxes. They sucked over $100 million in taxes out of the Barbados economy when that administration came to office shortly after early 2008. This administration yesterday proposed an austerity adjustment package of $1.2 billion over 3 years. We can argue the advisability of that. We can debate it forever. But the fact is, this is where we are, and our history tells us that we ought to be cautious in taking this approach because of our painful experience of the past. I have a question which I am forced to ask. I have a question which I believe some Barbadians will be asking themselves and asking of the government. Did this government with its 30-0 electoral victory, have a mandate for this approach to tackling the problems in our economy. We reasonably excited expectations, and I say we, Mr. Speaker, reasonably and understandably so, excited expectations, which were not beyond the realm of the real. But I just question myself and would ask others to reflect on this. Did we sufficiently send signals relative to the painful path ahead, the path upon which we are now embarked? I'm simply and honestly saying, Mr. Speaker, that reasonably and understandably so, we excited realistic expectations. But I'm asking the question which must come concomitantly with that. Did we sufficiently send signals to the country that this pain was up ahead and that this is the painful path upon which we would be embarking as a government? We all concur with the priorities to be addressed as raised by the government yesterday and as identified by the governor of the central bank not so long ago. A massive $20-odd billion in tax receipts under the past administration, with no significant possible input on productive capacity, no expansion, but rather embarrassing contraction in our ability to provide social services, such as free tertiary level education, a viable transport system, and a dependable sanitation services regime. This, I believe, is one of the things which is central to the indictment of the electorate on the past administration. Heavy levels of taxation, $22 billion in their 2 terms, more than the previous administration. At the end of the day, nothing to show for it in terms of the productive capacity of the nation. Taxation not used to bolster and enhance our productive capacity in any way. Nothing to show in terms of embellishment and improvement of our social services, but rather the shame of infrequent collection services, garbage, the shame of an absence of public service transport, policy working to the detriment of our young people with respect to the introduction of tuition fees at the university. That is what we got. That is what we got to fill our bellies after government filled its coffers with $22 billion in taxation. We are embarking upon another regime of enhanced taxation, and the people of Barbados, if they are to bear this pain, will be anticipating that at the end of the day, not that we would only have corrected our economic fiscal problems or debt troubles, but that we would have brought this country to a place where our social services are the better for it, and our productive capacity has been significantly enhanced. Our modest foreign reserves growth of $14 million in the first 3 months of this year still leaves us somewhat exposed relative to the ideal of a 12-week cover. And according to the governor, therefore, we need to stabilize measures of public finance in pursuit of sustainability. I suppose if it is to be captured in one sentence as to the goal of the presentation of the government and the Honourable Prime Minister of yesterday, it could be captured in that sentence. The need to stabilize measures of public finance in pursuit of sustainability. But even questions are raised even out of that. Quite obviously, rising domestic debt negates the efforts at stabilization. So we have to do something about our domestic debt. Generally, unresolved debt issues also create uncertainty and imperil prospects of new investment. We therefore have to do something about our debt situation. But secondly, we need to address the foreign reserves slide. Thirdly, critically, we need to create growth conditions. And whereas, in the case of the former two, one might identify in the presentation of yesterday efforts towards such achievement, when it comes to understanding that critically we need to create growth conditions, I'm not sure that this dynamic was captured in the presentation which we were given or treated to yesterday. And so, Mr. Speaker, here we are today. The program of government and its relationship with the IMF must answer those above issues. And it must do so while anticipating multiple significant variables. The variable of prospective oil price, energy price increases. The variable of the outflow from its select default position. The variable of domestic public service pay demands. The variable of the costs associated with addressing social service provisions and infrastructural repair and development challenges. I need to repeat that because it speaks to the context in which we are going to be pursuing the package, the program, which was given to us of yesterday. And we must do this while anticipating multiple significant variables, Mr. Speaker, important, very important, crucial variables operating in the global economy, both the domestic and global economy. Prospective oil and energy, or energy price increases, the outflow from our select default status, the domestic public service pay demands with which the government is confronted and to which it sought to respond as announced yesterday, the costs associated with addressing social service provisions, whether we speak of the hospital and other medical services, or transportation, or education, or the myriad other social services which historically we have become accustomed to. And infrastructural repair, we have massive issues now facing us on the South Coast, and potentially, as outlined by the minister, perhaps even more so, massive in Bridgetown. And then, of course, there are the ever-present normal development challenges. And so we look at some of the specifics of the proposals of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. Repealing the NSRL. We laud government for keeping its manifesto promise to repeal this all-pervasive and at the time unnecessary imposition on the backs of Barbadians, on the Barbadian economy. However, the removal of that levy has now been countered by the imposition of a raft of other taxes. That is where some people see the octopus image in the picture. We remove the NSRL, keeping a promise made in the election campaign, and a tax which many believe was necessary in terms of its removal. But we have replaced that now with a raft of other impositions. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are some who argue that the contracted rate of growth in our GDP of the last year was due less so to the imposition of the NSRL than it was to the underperformance of the tourism sector. And I heard that argument because I had concerns myself about the NSRL. I looked at the central bank report, which seems to suggest that part of our woes of the last year, though much may be indeed attributed to the NSRL, the underperformance of tourism spend is really the second devil in the room. And I think as a devil that we need to treat too. And this is the central bank report, Mr. Speaker, which if necessary can be made document. An extract from the central bank report, which if necessary can be made document of the House. The National Social Responsibility Levy must be understood relative to consumer behavior economics. It's a theory of economics which an insufficient number of people pay sufficient attention and credence to. Example, vis-a-vis consumer prioritization on their spending. You can look at it relative to food. We have to eat food every day, we have to buy, we can make choices as to what we eat, but we have to eat. And there was some protection from NSRL around the area, the sector of food. But then the consumer durables and other big ticket items, which were not the object of every day, every week, every month, every year purchase. And the NSRL was only in place for a short while. While I'm not defending its imposition or even challenging its removal, I'm just pointing to the reality to help us to sift through what was presented to us yesterday. Quite noticeably, the past administration did not achieve the anticipated gains from the NSRL. So clearly, it was counterproductive to the consumer impulse to spend and to therefore stimulate the economy. But the net effect of these new impositions, the raft of impositions alternative to the NSRL, the net effect of these new impositions is likely also to be reflected in a negative impact on economic activity going forward. There's the fuel tax. Now, the aims of this particular tax are noteworthy. To improve collections, which government must. That has always been an area of concern with reference to many impositions and taxes, government's capacity to collect. Secondly, to reduce the cost to motorists. To reduce the cost to motorists by proffering the assumption that a payment of a small tax at the pump will offset the cost of the annual road tax, which is being removed from the regime of taxation in Barbados. Thirdly, to provide for better ease of payment so that you don't have to pay a lump sum to the MTW, to the licensing authority, but that you pay a little each time you go to the pump. The example of my friend who uses $100 per week in fuel is instructive. They will move from $400 in road tax, they suggest, to $603.20 by payment at the pump. That's an increase. A ZM owner utilizing $300 in fuel per week, paying approximately $700 in tax, road tax, will find that this tax leaves him or her worse off. The situation could obviously then therefore be worse and much worse for ZRs and for the Transport Board, Public Transport Board. On the issue of the Transport Board, I would humbly suggest that there needs to be a clear policy going forward. A prudent policy framework, in my view, should include a guarantee to the Barbadian public of the provision of this as a social service for schools, for pensioners, and for those who are physically challenged. Provided, of course, this service should be provided, of course, by the state-owned entity. Secondly, a prudent policy on transport, in my humble submission, should include a regime for capital acquisition by owners of private transport, a regime to facilitate greater levels of ownership in other aspects of the service, and a regime of capital acquisition to allow for ownership not only by workers in the current public transport system, but by owners in the private sector providing public transport service. We need to reduce the costs to government relative to the purchase of Transport Board buses. We need to reduce the costs to government relative to fleet purchasing for a totally publicly owned public transport sector. Fleet maintenance, reduce the cost of fleet maintenance, reduce the cost of energy, reduce the cost of insurance. And we can do so by transforming the ownership in the commercial aspects of public transport. This in part could be achieved by facilitating capital access and other duty concessions for individuals and small cooperatives towards ownership of larger buses and coach-type vehicles, replacing the smaller vehicles involved in public service transport. Mr. Speaker, if I confuse you, let me attempt to clarify. I'm simply saying that we need a prudent framework, policy framework for transport in Barbados. Government should continue to provide public transport as a social service for schools, for pensioners, and categories of persons such as those who are physically challenged. Government needs to facilitate greater levels of ownership by those who are now employed in the state transport service. Government needs to reduce its costs relative to fleet, to maintenance, to energy, and to insurance by transforming the whole ownership structure in commercial aspects of public transport. There are too many, in my humble view, small, privately owned vehicles providing public transport in Barbados. Many ZRs, and even those which are slightly bigger in terms of the minibuses. And all I'm saying is, provide a capital access facility that encourages persons to buy into ownership of bigger buses eliminating the need for the state to acquire such vehicles to the extent that they now do, and facilitate that ownership not only by a capital access facility, but by reference to duties offered to such persons, allowing them either in their individual capacity or in small cooperatives of persons operating in this sector, so that we can have a transport system which is dependable, which is viable, which is regulated by a governmental authority, but not exacting the kind of cost upon the public purse as is now the case. This can help us to improve conditions for public travel, help us to improve and better regulate scheduling, so that the Barbadian economy can be served by a dependable public transport system, and this should enable us to have better levels of productivity as well. I believe strongly, Mr. Speaker, in democracy. I stand here on this side in this position principally because I believe strongly and passionately in our democracy, and that each of us in this honorable house, and that each of us who come to the elective arena in politics should ensure that what has been handed down to us in terms of our democratic traditions, and principally so by the founders and early leaders of the governing party, that what has been handed down to us is properly and well preserved, and that any threat or any limitation which suggests itself relative to the expansion of that democratic platform and those democratic privileges are offset by our actions. I stand here on this side, Mr. Speaker, principally out of that motivation. But I don't only believe strongly in political democracy. I believe strongly in economic democracy. In another life, I have said to those who constituted my colleagues around me that part of the principal mandate that the people of Barbados would next confer, would next put before this government when it came to office, even as it conferred the honor of a massive electoral defeat, would be that it had a responsibility to ensure that the legacy of the governing party was preserved and that that platform was embellished and democratic privilege expanded. That includes economic democracy. We have done well in political democracy. We have done well looking at it through the eye of the social sphere. But a lot remains to be done in terms of further enfranchising the citizens of this country and expanding democratic, economic democracy. Transportation is a major area for potential working class ownership in Barbados. We need to fight the forces that seek to control ownership of public transport in Barbados provided by the private sector. We need to fight that forces and to ensure that we do not operate in a system which harks of that which existed before, where ownership was consolidated in the hands of a few concessionaires. We long came away from that. This party now in office led the move to democratize the transport sector. And therefore, its principles now, having been given the honor, must seek to ensure that that fight is manfully persisted with, to ensure that we don't refer to a situation where ownership is consolidated in the hands of a few. Transport provides a significant area potentially for moving working class people into the ownership class in Barbados. I have said before, in another life, in another place, we must create a cadre of wealthy people in Barbados who come from the working class in Barbados. I have said, expressed it in these terms. We need to strive to create a few millionaires out of the working class of Barbados with each passing year. We need to bring our working class citizens to the embrace of a mindset which suggests that money is not wealth. A job will not always get you there, but ownership ought to be part of your aspirational effort. A government worth its salt will do its best to ensure that the environment is created within which working class people can aspire to ownership in Barbados, and transportation sector is one of those such signal areas, and we need to see what can be done to improve it there, while at the same time addressing our problems at the state-owned transport board with shortage of buses, and a high reliance on state subsidy. The new tax ban of 40% for those working for over $75,000. I reflect on this in this way. These are the people who employ domestic help. They spur small enterprise activity, such as landscaping, car washing, babysitting. But these are also people who pay mortgages and who are already under pressure pre this budget and its proposals. In Barbados, Mr. Speaker, 43% of bank credit is attributed to mortgages. 43%, almost half, is attributed to mortgages. When it comes to the credit unions, is 48% attributed to mortgages, virtually half. 85% when it comes to trust and finance companies. Almost 70% of household debt in Barbados is mortgage related. And the rate of non-performing loans is already outpacing the growth of mortgages in Barbados. I'm setting a context, because this is a context in relation to the mortgage market and people who have already entered into this debt. This is a context in which the prescriptions of this budget will now make themselves felt. This group of persons is already under pressure with previous tax increases and loss of allowances against which this administration railed while in opposition. So they've lost allowances. They're already under pressure from harsh tax measures imposed by the last government. Notwithstanding the removal of the NSRL, we have now introduced further levels of taxation, and the implications for this particular category of persons is worrying. This class was significantly eroded by the last administration's tax and fiscal policies. Corporation tax, we understand, is moving from 25% to 30% for a yield of $57 million in a year. Again, the question must be raised as to the potential negative impact on employment and business development. We need to assess whether a move as well in this direction puts us in a worse position relative to competing with other Caribbean jurisdictions for set-up businesses and new investment. My understanding is that Barbados enjoyed, because of its low corporation tax regime, an advantage with respect to potential setup of new business and investments, an advantage over our CSME neighbors. We're now moving in a direction where we are increasing corporation tax by 5%. There should be a health service contribution of 2.5%. I support the views of the Prime Minister with respect to the conditions and the experiences one is likely to have at the emergency room of the QEH. I've been there, I've seen it. I think also the physiotherapy department at the QEH is in need of similar attention. I've been there for the past 4 years with great frequency. Carried my sister, who had to undergo some rehabilitative therapy over time, 2 years. Went with her every week, almost. Carried another who had suffered misfortune and known to my family and a church membership, and who has had to go there with frequency. And I praise the staff at the physiotherapy department. But the need is for more space, better equipment, and increased staff. In our constrained circumstances, places like this can be forgotten because they're not necessarily up front in the public eye on an everyday basis, as is the emergency room at the QEH. But they both cry out for attention, and I support the view relative to the need to address some of our conditions obtaining in our institutions. Now, this departure tax to support BTMI and the Product Authority of the Tourism Ministry or sector, though I support the basic philosophy of moving these two entities towards a more private orientation through the public-private sector partnership as defined by the Honourable Prime Minister yesterday, I am unsure that these heavy increases in departure travel tax is the way to go. Question has to be asked, and more than philosophically as well, the question has to be asked, more than philosophically or rhetorically. To what extent have you really removed these two entities from the consolidated fund if taxpayers substantially still have to meet the bill? If substantially you're still meeting the bill by raising the tax that people pay, reference to departure and travel, it is still taxpayers' money, whether it goes through the formal consolidated fund or otherwise. And therefore, to what extent have we removed it? I look forward to hearing more about the workings of the public and private sector arrangements with reference to the two entities at the ministry in relation to the Ministry of Tourism. The cost of travel is already extremely high, particularly so among Caribbean destinations. It is just about easier for you and I to get to Miami as it is to get to Antigua in terms of the cost. And therefore, one questions the wisdom in a context where we want to see an enhanced sense of regional oneness, where we want to subscribe to notions of regional integration and movement of persons as a very pertinent activity within that whole sphere, one questions the advisability of this hefty, and the upper word is hefty, increase on departure tax. Imagine the added expense for a traveling family. And people more and more, if we observe the cultural trends, are traveling in families. Imagine the increased cost of a family vacation, even in St. Lucia, far less Toronto or Miami or New York. Caribbean governments ought really to be looking to see how they could reduce the cost of travel by eliminating many of the impositions by states on the cost of airline travel tickets. The Honourable Member for St. Philip South can probably speak more and with greater authority to that than I can. But governments ought really to see how the impositions of the various states on the cost of a ticket plays out as it affects the pocket of the traveler. And in many cases, those impositions are replicated from island to island. So what I paid in Barbados, I'm paying in Grenada on my way to Trinidad and on my way back. I think that is something we have to look at. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure my honorable friend will correct me, but mercifully so he will do. Now, this imposed travel cost has implications not only for the traveler, has implications for LIAT. And the government of Barbados is a major shareholder in that airline, which already struggles. Governments already struggle with having to support the costs of the movement of LIAT through this region. There are implications in this departure tax for that struggle and for that airline. But beyond this, Mr. Speaker, our whole tourism trust needs to be relooked. Perhaps our luxury destination brand is prohibitive to the middle-class traveler. We promote Barbados as a luxury brand destination. We advertise it as such. The large component of the travel market is the middle class, and to some extent working class, but predominantly so middle class, people who will come and spend some money. And the question is, does our promotion of Barbados as a luxury brand destination run counter to our capacity and ability to attract a percentage of that travel market constituted by the middle class? Imagine the thoughts of such a potential visitor when he or she sees such luxury brand advertising. I believe in situations like that, places like Iceland become even more appealing and attractive to travelers from the UK than a Barbados market, which is promoted as a luxury brand. We've got to find a way of dealing with that dilemma of selling ourselves in consonance with our value as a nation, as a destination, as a people, and as a product, but also being able at the same time to attract those who are lesser able to afford the luxuries implied by our advertising. We need to refresh imaginatively our tourism product. Our levels have been stagnant for at about 500,000 visitors or just beyond that for a number of years. Compare this with places like Aruba, with whom we enjoyed similar numbers more than a decade ago. we are still at the same volume and the same levels. They have long gone past over 1 million in long-stay visitor arrivals. We need to refresh in imaginative ways our product and our brand. Now in Barbados, we have to admit, unlike some of these other jurisdictions, that there's constrained development. For instance, no casinos and so on. So our potential for development is constrained, unlike some of our other competitors, and we have to admit that. But also, we need to consider, and I'm sure that we're aware of this, that our inputs are very much too overly priced. And that business of the cost of inputs to our tourism product has to be addressed with reference to high pricing. Some may argue that the industry is now sufficiently matured, that it should stand on its own feet, its own legs. But I think its importance to our economy and in our menu of service exports is such that we have to persist with some preference treatment at home and make it more competitive abroad with other destinations. So I don't support the view that concessions should be withdrawn from the tourism sector and redirected to other sectors. I think we have to find a way to do both, because the tourism industry at this particular juncture is too critical to our survival and our growth prospects. So we have to persist with support of that while encouraging other long-established sectors and emerging sectors. Increase in hotel and tourism-related charges. Now, these increases include the per room, per night charges for different classes of accommodation. It includes the 2.5% product levy on all direct tourism services, and the proposed 15% VAT by 2020. Now, these will all add to increased costs to visitors in what is already a high-price destination. It will also result in increased costs for many locals around whom a culture of staycation has been emerging in Barbados. This will result in increased costs for them and perhaps will retard an activity which has begun to grow in Barbados with some robustness. The capture in the tax net of the Airbnb and like businesses, in my view, is appropriate. However, one would want to be careful not to choke off the business aspirations of the small entrepreneurial class in Barbados. Though the capture of these entities in the tax net is reasonable, the rate should also be appropriate. And that's all I'm suggesting. Now, we may welcome the prospects of increased tax revenue of $60 million from the international business sector. And that is, we anticipate that in the context of hopefully revive viability in that sector. In my view, the last administration, and here's another plank upon which their indictment is lodged, the last administration was delinquent in defending and protecting our market share in this sector. Barbados once enjoyed the third highest concentration of Canadian business in this regard. But the leakage has been significant under the last administration and significantly injurious to the Barbados economy. And much of the development of our middle class experience was premised upon receipts derive from this international business sector. But as I said, the leakage here has been significant and injurious. My understanding is that we've lost about 20 offshore banks in recent time. And notwithstanding the pressures from the OECD and other sources, and notwithstanding the shifts in Canadian government policy of this of recent date, government policy under the last administration was both pathetic and worthy of the indictment which was served against them. This is one of the most significant areas in which the past administration was delinquent, and that is what I'm trying to suggest. A bit on the expenditure side of the proposals given yesterday. Increases to the public sector at a cost to government of over $60 million is noted. It is a pity that it has taken almost a decade, and it has come after much reversal of the economic fortunes of individuals. It is a pity also that it has come in the context of the tax regime introduced yesterday. We lament the fact that public servants were denied an increase in a context of raising costs and raising taxation. Now an increase comes of 5% until 2019, after much reversal of their economic fortunes, and in the middle of new impositions which they themselves would have to face. There is the repeated image of the octopus in the presentation yesterday. Similarly, the raise in non-contributed pension from $155 per week to from $155 to $225. A 45% increase, some may say, is hefty when one considers that pensions in Barbados historically have moved in line and in keeping with the rate of inflation. But I don't think that's the only consideration that one should bring or can bring to the table. I consider a crime against humanity as to the treatment meted out to our seniors, our pensioners under the last administration. With increased costs of living, increased costs of medication, a state, a government is judged in part as to its nobility by the way it treats its elderly, its seniors, persons upon whose backs that nation itself has been built. And over the last several years of the current administration, with tax upon tax, increased costs upon increased costs, insufficient shelter was provided for those who constitute our elderly community, our pensioners community. And we welcome the relief that comes, hefty in some people's view, 45%. But this is money going to people who have built this country, your mothers and mine. Some of you are young enough, your grandmothers and mine. And therefore, I think, considering what transpired in the past, one needs to look at this particular benefit with a more merciful eye. But there's a garbage and sewage tax that we cannot look at through such merciful eyes. This will result in an increase in water bills to households by about $45 over $40 per month. In many cases, 100% or more increase per month, and to businesses by 50% of their current water bills. Again, the potential decrease in employment has to be acknowledged. The impact and hardship upon the poorest in society. I can escape purchasing a bread. I might choose to purchase biscuits. I can't escape the use of water. So this particular imposition is going to be all pervasive, touching even the poorest of us. And its impact upon business could possibly, very likely, harm our employment generation thrusts. So government is aiming to achieve fiscal levels of comfort in short order, with total revenue for 2018-19 estimated at $3.2 billion, or 32% of gross domestic product, recurrent expenditure of $3.20 billion, or 29% of GDP, and with a capital expenditure of $400 million, leaving a deficit of $140 million, or 1.4% of GDP. In a full year, government anticipates reducing the fiscal deficit by $183 million, with a further adjustment of $200 million in phase 2 and 3 of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. The additional savings from debt restructuring is expected to help, as is stated in the budget, arrive at sustainable debt levels in 5 years. But my concerns, premise on the plan, are and would be excessive taxation, a route we have traveled before and which led us to this point of misery. 2, reprofiling of debt, which is not likely to yield adequate levels of savings. 3, does not fully anticipate the further austerity of the impending IMF program. 4, there's no sufficiently meaningful outline of growth strategies. Passing reference was made to new energy, technology, smart government, agro-industry, small enterprise, but no specific indications were given as to where we're going with these. 5, with reduced earning capacity and having reached our borrowing limits externally and our inability to pay our way, we need to control and manage expenditure. And I'm not too sure that the budget paid sufficient attention to that in the current context and with an IMF program pending shortly. 6, to grow the economy and to grow employment, we must facilitate the expansion and or the creation of new businesses. And I'm suggesting that some of these impositions could very well run counter to that desire to either create and or stimulate the expansion of new businesses. 7, there's no discretion really in several of these tax measures. With the NSRL, I could choose to buy this or not buy that. With many of these measures, the discretion is not there. And so the tax is something I'm forced to bear. Now, I want to say, I pass not judgment, but I just offer this as a caution and a consideration. Economic policy is not best guided by political consideration. Austerity in the early days of a popular administration is thought to be prudent and workable politically, with an easing at about 3 to 3.5 years of the austerity to provide for relaxation and to court the electorate for its favor at the next time of the polls. I'm not suggesting that this is the case here. I'm saying that it is a caution of which we all ought to be reminded that though it may be prudent to do it early while you are still popular and establish a regime for about 3 years, after which you relax it in an effort to start to set the platform for currying favor with the electorate. Though it may be politically prudent, I do not know that it is necessarily morally acceptable, or is the Barbadian public deserving of such treatment. I do not express that as a judgment or an indictment. I do not suggest that that is my assessment of the motivation for these impositions. I simply say that we must guard against that type of approach to governing. And Mr. Speaker, a word on the entity called White Oaks. The entity which will be interfacing with our creditors on our behalf. Now, though this is not similar to the Cahill situation, the recent Cahill fiasco has left a bad taste in the mouths of Barbadians. And therefore, we need to have more information divulged on White Oaks. And don't say to me or the Barbadian electorate that we can research this for ourselves. There's ample availability of technology. It behoves the government to tell us what are we getting into exactly with these people, and who are they, having, when once we were in a different position, queried often the then administration for their misdeeds. Without taking the Barbadian public into their confidence. And so, Mr. Speaker, we need to hear the bona fides of White Oaks. We need to understand whether or not they're the subjects of any transactional interest conflicts. We need to find out if White Oaks has any local connections. It would be good if we knew who their principals are. We need to know what is the full extent of their involvement. Is it just that they are interfacing with our creditors on our behalf, full stop? Or is there further involvement? My research suggests that they do negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. Question is, are they going to be so involved with this country and this government in our negotiations with the fund over the pending program? I understand also they do strategic reviews of state-owned enterprises. Are they in any way going to be assisting the Barbados government with any such look at our own state-owned enterprises as we seek to address the issue of cost to government relative to statutory corporations, especially by means of transfers? Understand they also give specialist advice on recovery strategies and recovery prospects. And will this be part of their relationship with us? And then ultimately, what is the cost of engaging White Oaks? What is the cost to Barbados of engaging White? Now, I'm not privy to any of this information, and I don't know if the Barbadian people are. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps there ought to be. One of the questions I asked myself in reflecting on the budgetary presentations of yesterday, proposals of yesterday, is going forward, and in light of the enormous mandate that the governing administration now has at the will of the electorate, what is the state construct and the economy construct that we will be seeking to create and to establish in a new Barbados. And how does this moment and this program anticipate that? Are we going to be embracing the view that our economy at this time oversubscribes to entitlements? There are some people who express that strongly. We become too entitled as a people. There are too many social service benefits. I don't necessarily advocate that. But the question is, will we as a country, as a state, as an economy, be embracing this view? Perhaps our earliest opportunity to respond to that will be when we have to face the IMF shortly in serious negotiations for some economic relief. Are these entitlements beyond our capacity now to afford? What must we do to so enhance that capacity that we can retain the entitlements to which we have become accustomed? Do we establish and enshrine discriminatory mechanisms such as mean testing? I'm talking about enshrining. Do we establish as well as enshrine discriminatory mechanisms such as means testing or similar mechanisms to constitute the basis as to how we allocate social service benefits going forward? Thirdly, is there to be an absolute or ideal size relative to the public service in Barbados? I hear often the public service is too large. I'm not an economist. My layman's thinking tells me that the size of the public service should bear some relationship to the size and viability of the economy at the time, and that therefore in a vacuum you can't say that the public service is too large. So is there to be an ideal and absolute size relative of public service, or should it be made relative to size and buoyancy of the economy? And what is to be the profile of that public service as this government leads us into the next several years? To what extent, number 4, is the state to be an entrepreneurial state? I don't think that we have ever sufficiently settled that question in our own thinking. To what extent is the state to be an entrepreneurial state? Number 5, what is to be the character of our statutory corporations and state-owned enterprises? Will we have them continue to be repositories of political misfits and centers for unproductive mismanagement? A government with this large mandate is in a position to act decisively and to make decisions which constitute a vital difference to any entities which are part of the lifeblood of this country. Number 6, what is to be the relationship of the state to the market and the players in the market going forward? We have now come out of the dark experience of seeming relations between state and private players in the market, of which we are not particularly proud. Our view is that this was the bed in which the entity we call, if you call it an entity, this is the bed in which the entity we call corruption was conceived. When government gets in bed with players in the private market in circumstances not legitimized by state precepts or regulations. I'm simply asking, how are we going to behave going forward? Are we going to see an end to the specter of consolidation around some of the sectors of economic activity in Barbados? Consolidation, corruption, which seem to mark part of the policy platform of the last government, we would like to think is a thing buried in the past. We need clear signals from this government as to how the state will behave in relation to the market and to private players in the market. What are to be the absolute parameters within which state principals will operate, ministers of government and other state principals will operate, and what unvarying and unyielding measures of accountability will be put in place to counter any tendencies towards misdoing. I think the time is right as the government seeks to correct the problems in the economy, that it also sends strong signals that it is about eliminating the potential for and the predisposition of principals who act on behalf of government to create their own private fortune on the backs of the taxpayers while the people of Barbados suffer pain after pain. That is all I'm saying. And to what extent will governance take primacy over government? And I think if there's one thing to which we can speak with absolute certainty is that under the last administration, it was more about government, its principles, and its partners in the private market than it was about governance in the interests of the people of Barbados. And that is a question that I'm raising, is a consideration I'm putting before this new administration with its large mandate of decent people. Mr. Speaker, this budget clearly indicates who will pay the price to get us out of the mess in which we have found ourselves. Who will pay the price? All Barbadians are being asked to pay the price. Even some visitors are being asked to pay the price. If you want to enjoy our pleasures, you pay the price, a part of our pain. So the question is answered, who will pay the price to get us out of this mess? But I have another issue, and it is this. What this budget does not tell us is who will pay the price for getting us into this mess in the first place. Barbadians want to know that somebody, some entity, some group pay the price for getting us into this mess in the first place. If it's a question of bad policy, the electorate has spoken and dismissed the last administration. If it's a question of misdeed, corruption, and ill-doing, Barbadians want to know what the current administration is going to do about having somebody pay the price for their pain. And so I'm putting that up as a second question, the one we need answered. Who will pay the price for getting us into this mess? I don't subscribe to the view that it was the former administration with its borrowing patterns. Former Barbados Labour Party administration with its borrowing patterns. The borrowings of that administration gave us foreign exchange earning capacity. It gave us productive capacity. Barbados was made the better for it. People knew where the money went. But we must be told why we have nothing to show for $22 billion in taxation by a government over 2 terms. Why is there nothing to show after $22 billion of taxation on the people's backs and pockets? Nothing to show. No buses, no trucks to collect garbage. Bad roads. I've said more than once, and I was influenced to say by my experience at the moment. Driving, you see a creature run across the road. I've seen that with frequency, and I've had cause and pause to say, there are more rats on the streets of Barbados crossing from side to side than transport board buses. I'm sure you had that experience as well. If you drive out there, you see these rats scurry across our streets, Mr. Speaker. You see them? Scurry across our streets. So you notice the frequent presence of rodents, but the not so frequent presence of buses after massive taxation, after 10 years plus occupying the seat of government. We have to know why government contracts were limited to a couple repeated beneficiaries. People of Barbados want to know, and this government, if it understands its mandate, must also understand that the people want to know why contracts were limited to a couple repeated and seemingly favored beneficiaries. Want to know why social services are so poor? Public servants are broke. They want to know why public servants are broke, why infrastructure around us is crumbling, why maintenance management of government buildings is not carried out while government makes recourse to tenancy arrangement with private sector players closely connected with them. People of Barbados want to know of these things. And so, Mr. Speaker, I've come here today not to practice the politics of opposition, as is the customary case. Did not come here today to indulge in political brinksmanship. Did not come here today to indulge in personal attack. Did not come here today to engage in filibustering for the notice of the media. Did not come here for any of those purposes. Simply came here today, Mr. Speaker, to give my humble response to the proposals presented yesterday by the Honourable Minister of Finance, which I believe are designed by government to stabilize the situation, but which will impose a tax regime on the backs of Barbadians, which could be counterproductive. And at a time when our earning capacity is constrained, our capacity to borrow is also constrained. At a time when we're about to meet around the table with the IMF, at a time when the electorate, the Barbadian community was already reeling from excessive taxation, I've simply come to ask the questions which would arise in any reasonable person's mind. Have we exercised the necessary caution? Did we do this for the right motives? Did we think this through? And at the end of the day, after we have gone through all of this pain, what will there be to show that we have not suffered in vain? And I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well,
The Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to lend my support to these budgetary proposals and financial statements for 2018, recognizing the state of the Barbados economy for what it is. But before I get into my speech, Mr. Speaker, let me thank, first of all, God and the good people of Christchurch East Central, who just 20 days ago determined that I was to be the one who will represent them in this august chamber to make sure that their interests and the interests of the people of Barbados from a financial perspective is looked after. This government was elected with resounding confidence by the people of Barbados. They did not elect us to make excuses. They elected us to fix the problems in this country. And so it is our best judgment that as we move forward over the next few weeks, months, and years, that the people of this country must know at every stage how any measure, any policy that's crafted by this government, how it will affect them. And so therefore, what is before the House for consideration has been a manifestation in response to the total mess that has been created by the previous administration of this country. And so therefore, we do not come here to make sport. We have come here to start to fix the problems that confront Barbados. And whilst there are many who may wish to question the motives of a new government, I want to assure the people of Barbados quite firmly that the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast is indeed not or can never be compared to the former member for St. Michael South. I also want to state quite clearly for all Barbados to understand that I am not to be compared with the former member for St. Michael Northwest. And so therefore, the public finances of this country over the next 3 years shall be returned to the measure of stability that the people of this country have grown accustomed to under Barbados Labour Party governments. So when we tell you that the measures that we've implemented yesterday, specifically to deal with some of the statutory corporations, that will be taken off the books of central government, that over the course of the next few years, when the people of this country start to see improvements in the provision of public services in this country, you will understand why. Because the previous administration raped this country with tax after tax after tax and failed to live up to the obligation of the delivery of public services to which we have grown accustomed. And so I say to the members of this House and the people of this country that the Ministry of Finance is going to set this economy back on track. The first order of business, ladies and gentlemen and members, is to provide a level of confidence to the entire market. Confidence. And the people of this country repose their confidence in the Barbados Labour Party on May 24th. And that signal of confidence, ladies and gentlemen, that signal was delivered yesterday by the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast. Because the first thing that you have to do when you find yourselves in a situation of hardship is to first of all recognize that there is a problem. You must stop denying that there is a problem. And this Barbados Labour Party government, we have determined that Barbados is faced with many problems. We've confronted those problems, and the proposals put to the country yesterday is a clear indication that this government intends to take the responsibility for fixing the many problems in this country. Mr. Speaker, the road ahead is going to be challenging. And whilst we did not create the problem, we can fix it. But the people of this country must be brought along that path to recovery. And the measures outlined yesterday, Mr. Speaker, whilst trying to maintain a balance within this Barbados economy, we know that things are tough for people in this country. We know that. We know that. But confidence, Mr. Speaker, is the key. Because whilst from a macroeconomic perspective, all of the indicators, you've heard it before, everything that's supposed to be up, down. And everything that's supposed to be down, they are up. And as we move forward over the next few weeks and months, Mr. Speaker, the policies of this Barbados Labour Party government shall return to a level of normalcy, the macroeconomic indicators to which the people of this country have grown accustomed. But what will also happen over the course of the next few years, ladies and gentlemen, is that the households in this country will also start to see the benefits of these policies, because we are in a hole. And we must now act decisively. There is no time for doubt, Mr. Speaker. We are Barbados. We said so during the campaign. We must act like how Barbados acts, Mr. Speaker. And this government intends to lead the people of this country back to a path where, wherever you go, regionally or internationally, the story must be told that Barbados is back, Mr. Speaker. 10 years ago, we were rated AA. AA. The provision of public services in this country, Mr. Speaker, was unparalleled. Yes, there were a few things that needed improving, but we were on our way to becoming a first world country. And in the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker, in the last 10 years, every aspect of our lives as Barbadians have deteriorated. Every aspect. And so when we came to office, we had to make a most fundamental decision about what do we do to make sure that we send the right signals to everybody that it cannot be business as usual. And so therefore, when we made the decision to suspend external debt payments, it was not done lightly, because Barbados has always had a record of honoring its debts. But we have a problem. And the signal that everybody expected of any Barbados government is to be able to fix the problems in the country. And it would have been easy to simply patch it up for another 6 months, and then at the end of the year we could find another fix to patch it up. But that is not the way Barbados behaves. That is not the way that the people of this country expect its government to behave. Because the Barbados Labour Party has a track record of managing the affairs of this country where we deal decisively with matters, Mr. Speaker. And this Barbados Labour Party government is no different to any other Barbados Labour Party government. The people have turned to us to fix the problems in this country. And what was presented yesterday is the start, Mr. Speaker, of that fix. Because the road ahead will be challenging. But we intend to make sure that every aspect of the lives of Barbadians are improved over the next 5 years. Now, the member for St. Michael or Northeast indicated to the, or reminded, I should say, the public yesterday of an article that I would have written 5 years ago. And that article was entitled, "Who Will Put the Genie Back in the Bottle?" And I want to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that I never thought 5 years ago when I wrote that article that I would be standing here today to be part of the solution of putting that genie back in the bottle. And I stand here as a proud graduate of the University of the West Indies. And I know that I have benefited from all that Barbados has had to offer. And it's with that, Mr. Speaker, that I want to say emphatically that the choice of your government to invest in its young people is an important one. Because coming from Bank Hall, there was nobody to pay any fees for me, Mr. Speaker. And like many thousands of Barbadian young men and women, there's still nobody to pay fees for them. And we do not know in 10, 20, 30 years' time who will be able to come to the fore for Barbados. And so I stand here to defend the decision of this Barbados Labour Party government. Because it's not only just those at the University of West Indies, it is those across the entire spectrum of tertiary education in this country. We must invest in our young people. Because having determined that education, health, and the safety of our citizens will be the absolute priorities of any government that the Barbados Labour Party will have the honor of administering for this country, we must now deliver for the people of this country. It is important to send a signal to the thousands of young people that Barbados is worth fighting for, such that any opportunity that's available to young people in this country, they feel a sense of confidence that they have a stake in this country. And so as we commit under these proposals to finance tertiary education at the university, that too, as the Minister responsible for education will come later and indicate, the entire tertiary education system now has to be relooked. But the government will support it, because these are the very people that we expect over the next 20 years to move this country forward. People that will get up and go to work every day knowing that they can make a contribution to this beautiful Barbados. And I want to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that over the last 19 days, I really want to thank the staff at the Ministry of Finance, because the work that we've done in the last 19 days seems like 19 months, Mr. Speaker. And I want to publicly thank the staff at the Ministry of Finance, because they have worked night and day to make sure that we get this right. And the Prime Minister, over the last 19 days, Mr. Speaker, would have communicated more with the public and engaged the widest cross-section of stakeholders than the previous Prime Minister would have done in 10 years. Leadership matters, Mr. Speaker. Leadership matters. And I want to thank the Honourable Member for St. Michael North East for what she said on the campaign trail. She cajoled and she harassed me to get involved in politics. And I want to say to the people of Christchurch East Central and the people of Barbados that that was the best decision that I would have made to enter politics after I decided to marry my wife. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker.
Those are positive asides, Honourable Member. Those are positive asides I'm hearing.
Of course, of course. Mr. Speaker, the way that the public finances of this country were mismanaged in the last 10 years is simply scandalous. And I really want to support the leader of the opposition for his question about who will pay the price. Because the people of this country go to the polls periodically to elect a government. And when that government does not act in their interests, it is important that the very institutions of the widest part of government ensures that there's accountability. And in very short order, this government shall respond. But we must first and foremost make sure that there's a measure of stability upon which every single person, every single business in this country can go about their daily business knowing that their government has their back. But as I stand here, I want to say emphatically, there's no economic policy that could be successful if there is significant corruption pervading the society or even the governance structures. And so when I said earlier that the Minister of Finance and myself, that we are not to be in any way compared to the previous dispensation, then the people of Barbados would understand that we mean business. Because it is our responsibility to make sure that Barbados can pay its bills, that Barbados can deliver the level of public services that the public would have grown accustomed to. But we are at a point in our history where this is truly Barbados's darkest hour. And in that darkest hour, we have to make some very fundamental decisions. And part of that decision making is to take away the pride, in a sense, or I should say the false pride, Mr. Speaker. Because we must now humble ourselves as members of Parliament, as ministers, and even as a country, and recognize that each and every one of us will have to play a significant contribution to moving this country forward. And so wherever there are good ideas to contend, this government shall listen to those ideas. Because the previous government never engaged the public of Barbados in solving any problem in Barbados. And over the course of the last 19 days, as I said, I have seen the Prime Minister probably more times over the last 19 days, engaging people, meeting with people to get to the root of many of these problems. But, Mr. Speaker, the work is not yet done. We are not in any means out of the woods. This is the start of the process. And every member of this government would have committed themselves to ensuring that the ministries that they're responsible for, that some measure of order is returned to the functions of government. Because the signals that we now send, not just to the public servants, but to the people of this country, is that Barbados has to take responsibility for getting out of this situation. There is nobody coming to help us, Mr. Speaker. We have to save ourselves. We have acknowledged, yes, that we must go to the International Monetary Fund. But we don't just go there because we don't have a choice. There are always choices. There are always choices. But we go to engage the International Monetary Fund knowing that we are rooted in a philosophy that is consistent with the ideals of Barbados and that of the Barbados Labour Party. And we will engage the International Monetary Fund in very robust discussions as we've already done. But the people of Barbados must know that this government will stand in your interests. We will make decisions, and whilst there will be times that people may disagree with the decisions being taken, all that we ask of you is to examine the results. We want you to hold us accountable. because the state of Barbados is at its worst as we've ever seen in any of our lives. And all of us in here and all of us in Barbados would have seen progress in each of our lives. And in the last 10 years, there's been nothing to resemble progress for anybody in Barbados except a few. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. I stand here as a young Barbadian-ish. A young Barbadian. Very proud of what I know Barbados can be. And it hurts me as an economist, as a father, to know that the current economic situation that we're in, it wasn't caused by aliens, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't caused by foreigners, Mr. Speaker. It was caused by Barbadians like all of us in this room. And that is the part of this whole thing that I do not understand. I do not understand it, Mr. Speaker. So these budgetary proposals that were delivered to this House yesterday, for me, marks a watershed in this country. Because all of us, Mr. Speaker, must be in this rescue plan together. All of us. So whilst the people of this country are being asked to make a sacrifice for a little longer, and we are also asking our international partners, whether they're tourist creditors, business people, investors, to also share in that burden. Because it cannot only be good for people to invest in Barbados when the economy is going well, only to withdraw when things are not going good. So we are asking every single person, whether you're a Barbadian, whether you like to live in Barbados, whether you're an investor, to come on this journey of recovery with Barbados. Because the very reasons that people would have chosen to invest in Barbados before, Mr. Speaker, this Barbados Labour Party government intends to restore. Because as I told you earlier, Mr. Speaker, confidence is the currency upon which economic growth is founded. And the people of Barbados, Mr. Speaker, are confident again. And even though these measures introduced yesterday will indeed mean that many persons in this country may find it a little tougher, we have found the right balance, Mr. Speaker, the right balance, such that the confidence not just of individuals, but the confidence of the business community in this country is now at a level that it wasn't for the last 10 years. And it is that confidence, Mr. Speaker, the confidence in this country, at a consumer level, at a business level, at an investor level, it is that confidence that will see Barbados to safety. Mr. Speaker, we are Barbados. And I shall repeat that, the length and breadth of this country, because whilst I know there are a lot of people in this country that have questions right now, we must believe in ourselves. And whilst we engage the IMF, we will engage our global creditors, we shall engage everybody. But this recovery plan, make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, will be Barbados's recovery plan.
The honourable member has 5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, the public finances have been left in a mess. But it is leadership, clear, decisive leadership, that will get us through this situation. The country has already seen evidence of clear, decisive leadership. And over the coming weeks and months, as we continue to engage not just the social partners, but individuals across this country, it is that leadership, Mr. Speaker, that will inspire the confidence in our people, the confidence in our people to see us through. And so long as that confidence remains high, Mr. Speaker, no matter how hard things may become for the people of this country, because this journey has just begun. And the next 18 months, Mr. Speaker, the next 18 months is going to be tough. But the people of this country will see light at the end of that tunnel. And with each passing week and month, Mr. Speaker, that light shall become closer and closer, because this Barbados Labour Party government, Mr. Speaker, with the support of the social partners, with the support of the country, we will get Barbados out of this mess. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure you, I want to assure this Honourable House that at the appropriate time, as we move forward and this economy has been stabilized, all of the questions that have been put to this government shall be answered, because the people of this country deserve transparency. The people of this country deserve accountability. And so long as I have the responsibility for finance in this country, Mr. Speaker, those assurances will be delivered. Before I wrap up, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to this House and to the Prime Minister, Christchurch East Central, we are all aboard for love of country. I thank you. I'm glad.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of today's sitting until 2:25 p.m.
I beg to second it, Mr. Speaker.
Question is that this Honourable House be suspended until 2:25? Until 2:25 in the forenoon. All those in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This House stands suspended until 2:25 in the forenoon. Didn't happen.